Hello everybody, my name is Nathalie Gontier and I work at the Faculty of Science of the University of Lisbon, where I am sponsored by the Portuguese Foundation for Science and Technology. And I'm going to be giving a talk on reticulation and synergistic trait evolution in human communities. And I'm going to be giving that talk together with Anton Sukhoverkov from Kuban University in Russia, who is here with us in the audience. But so I'm going to give the presentation for the both of us. And so what are we going to talk about? We're going to talk about reticulate evolution, and we're going to investigate how there is an importance to study sociocultural evolution. So I define reticulate evolution as it occurs by means of symbiosis, symbiogenesis, lateral gene transfer, infective heredity, and hybridization. And so we're going to look into several case studies of how that is important for understanding sociocultural evolution. And so we're going to look into human, animal, and plant interactions, diet microbiome relationships, and also host pathogen interactions. And the main thesis that we're going to bring for you today is that reticulate evolution necessitates an understanding of behavioral and cultural evolution at a community level, where synergistic organizational traits evolve. So the term synergy refers to cooperation, and so we're going to look into how there is a cooperation between organizational traits at a community level. And so let's kick off by looking into the nature of reticulate evolution. What is typical about reticulate evolution is that evolutionary lineages can cross, or they can transfer information horizontally, or they can even merge sometimes. And that differs from how we are accustomed of thinking about evolution in neo-Darwinian terms, because their evolution is understood as a ramification process where evolutionary lineages will diversify over time. So then you get a splitting pattern. And what happens with the study of reticulate evolution is that scholars investigate how there is this merging between evolutionary lineages. So reticulate evolution can occur by several mechanisms and processes. And one form whereby reticulate evolution can occur is by means of lateral gene transfer. And that is something that occurs a lot within unicellular organisms such as bacteria. They can freely transfer genetic material amongst one another and sometimes also just pick up genetic material from that bacteria that they find in their surroundings, for example. Another form whereby reticulate evolution can occur is by means of symbiogenesis. And what happens there is that cells are being transferred. So we know that symbiogenesis has played a very important role in the origin of the eukaryotic cell, which are cells with nucleus. And so these cells underlie any kind of multicellular organism. And so what happens with multicellular organisms such as plants, animals, is that they also often have tiny cell bodies within their cells, which are called organelles, and several of these have a bacterial origin. So what we know now is that many millions of years ago, the first eukaryotic beings started to basically engulf bacteria. They started to eat bacteria, and some of these then evolved into these organelles. So that is a form of cell transfer. And then another form of reticulate evolution is evolution as it occurs by means of infective heredity. That is a term that was introduced by Joshua Lederberg, and that refers to pathogen transfer. So when we get the flu or when we get a bacterial infection, what happens is that there is a transfer of pathogens within a community of members. And then another form of reticulate evolution is evolution as it occurs by means of hybridization. And hybridization that makes use of sexual reproduction. And so we know that hybridization has played a very significant role in hominin evolution. There have been several hybridization events between humans and Neanderthals, Neanderthals and Denisovans, and also between all of them and unidentified other hominin species. Now we also find reticulate evolution in sociocultural evolution. So we have phenomena such as cargo cults or linguistic borrowing, cultural contact, multiculturalism, also the idea of one day creating transhumans or creating hybrids between humans and computers, for example. All of this is something that rests upon the availability and the existence of some kind of reticulate evolution. And so that is something that is sometimes ignored within the neo-Darwinian literature that focuses on the study of units of selection. And these have been defined as genes, as replicators, as linguemes, units of linguistic evolution, or as memes, units of cultural evolution. But the reticulate aspect of cultural evolution there has been denied. And so one of the things that I have done in the past is I have introduced the symbiont as a unit of reticulate evolution. And the idea that there is reticulation in sociocultural evolution is something that goes back all the way to Alfred Gruber. But what happened at that time when he was talking about cultural diffusion and cultural blending, etc., was that he saw that as something that was completely different from evolutionary research as it was occurring at that time within evolutionary biology, because their scholars were studying a vertical evolution, and so the ramification of the tree of life. But today, there is this emphasis more on network-like evolution, on reticulate evolution, and that is also something that can fit within a broader history of scientific thinking, where we at present see a transition between trees and networks, but these also themselves are something that replaces older ideas of change, of being, and older ideas of wheels of time. So in that regard, this entire transition towards network thinking is something that is part of a more broad scientific evolution and even a scientific revolution. And now for part two, let's look at some case studies. So where do we find symbiosis in sociocultural evolution? Well, one example is in the many human, animal, and plant interactions that we maintain through agriculture and through herding. So a lot of research on the origin and evolution of agriculture is focused upon how humans have been artificially selecting and artificially breeding certain crops and certain animal species. But in many ways, this is first of all a form of symbiosis. So this is something that has not been appreciated to the fullest, that any kind of agricultural existence that we have is based upon a fundamental act of symbiosis. Now, in this regard, it's important to note that symbiosis itself is a neutral term. It merely refers to the living together of unlike named organisms, but symbiosis can be beneficial and it can also be harmful for the individuals that maintain the symbiosis. So in that regard, there is a distinction between neutralism, commensalism, amensalism, mutualism, parasitism, and synechrosis. And so when we think about agriculture, that does not mean that the symbiotic interaction is of such a nature that it is beneficial. In many ways, agriculture is also an exploitation of animals, of course, but it is a form of symbiosis. Now, another way whereby reticulate evolution has played a very significant role in human evolution is through our diet microbiome relationships, which are also symbiotic relationships that we maintain with our microbiome and our viriome. And so we know that our microbiome has played a very significant role in the evolution of the human placenta. We know that bacteria have an impact, our microbiome has an impact on our brain and on cognition, and it also impacts social communication. And so we are all holobionts. We are organisms made up of an enormous amount of other organisms, of microbes. And so we are holobionts in that regard, and that is something that is also not expressed, for example, in theories such as the expensive tissue hypothesis that looks into the costs and the benefits that we have of having large brains, for example. Like at this moment in time, scholars are investigating the costs and the benefits that we have from our microbiome. And so this is also bringing forth new research important for understanding human evolution. And then another way whereby reticulate evolution is important for us for understanding our past, but also our present, is through the study of host pathogen interactions. And there, of course, an example is the current pandemic that we are in today, the COVID-19 virus, which is a virus that is currently maintained by the human population, where there is constant interaction, horizontal transfer between individuals. But we also know that we got this virus, that it originates in bats, and so that it must have somehow from bats gone to humans, and probably through intermediate species. So all of that is a form also of symbiosis, of an interaction that exists between different organisms. And so in that regard, it's also very important to note that symbiosis is not necessarily a happy way of living together. It is sometimes also parasitic in this regard, especially in regard of the COVID-19 virus. It is very parasitic upon us. And that brings us to our third part of our talk, which is the main thesis. Reticulate evolution necessitates an understanding of behavioral and cultural evolution at a community level, where synergistic organizational traits evolve. And this is an idea that I have been developing together with Anton Sukhoverkov from Cuban University. So what we have been doing is we have been looking into how evolution occurs above the organismal level, because any kind of reticulate evolution is evolution that extends an individual organism. Sociocultural evolution, linguistic evolution is also evolution that extends an individual organism. So the question then is, how can you start to make sense of that evolutionarily? And so in that regard, we have also been going back to the work of Peter Corning, which is a very important evolutionary biologist, who has introduced the idea of synergistic selection. And so a synergy, what is a synergy? A synergy is basically a cooperation that exists between more than one individual. And so that underlies community formation. And so our main idea is that we need to introduce the level of the community as a level where evolution occurs. We need to recognize that. And that is also something that differs from the classic neo-Darwinian synthesis. And so now we really have to do some theory, some theoretical biology to better understand that. So the neo-Darwinian synthesis basically is founded upon the idea that the unit of evolution is the organism, that it evolves at the level of the environment, and that it evolves by means of natural selection. So if you look at that from within a hierarchy, you have the idea that genes on a micro level bring forth the organism on a meso level, and that the organism then brings forth the species on a macro level. That is also what is being modeled when we look into the tree of life, when we look into how lineages diversify. So from within a hierarchical perspective, what is being said there is that the lower level genes bring forth the focal level that bring forth the upper level. And that is what is called in technical terms upward causation. So here you see that image again. So upward causation on the left is a study of evolutionary affordances. It is a study of how genes enable the evolution of organisms and how they enable the evolution of species. Now, in the Evo-Devo school and also within cultural evolution, there is the study of whether or not there is such a thing as downward causation, whether how a species evolves can influence how an organism evolves, and how an organism evolves can influence how genes evolve. And that is basically the main point of epigenetic research and of Evo-Devo, that development, cultural development, linguistic development can impact the future course of evolution. And so that is downward causation. That is a concept that was first introduced by Donald Campbell within psychology. Now, we even want to go further than that, and in that regard, I have introduced the concept of reticulate causation. When we want to investigate how, for example, a bacteria infects an organism, or how an organism belonging to one species carries a pathogen that then jumps to another species from within another lineage, what we need there is a concept of reticulate causation. And it is this form of reticulate causation that also underlies the formation of communities. And so in that regard, and this is something that Anton and I are pleading for, what we are saying is that beyond genes, organisms, and species, you have to introduce the community as a level of evolution. And so in that regard, we have defined the communities as levels of evolution, and so we define them as an agglomeration of interacting populations of which the individual members can belong to the same as well as to different species. And that is something that is often overlooked. So in that regard, there have been concepts such as the group or a population or demes, but all of that always belong to the same species. And so we really want to broaden that perspective and say, let's go beyond the group, let's go beyond a certain population of a certain species, let's look into community formation, and let's recognize that as a level of evolution. And so what happens at the level of communities is that you have the evolution of community traits. And so these are units of evolution, and we define those as synergistic organizational traits that characterize the community and that result from the cumulative, transgenerational, and constructed niches resulting in turn from biological, ecological, and sociocultural extragenetic inheritance. And so that is the main message that we have. And for further details, we really recommend you if you want to look into our journal in biosystems. It's also on my academia page, and so you can just download that freely. And so take-home messages of today is that we need to recognize that there is a plurality and that there is multidirectional causality. So I'm not saying that the neo-Darwinian synthesis is wrong, far from it. I'm saying that we need to complement it with a view on reticulate evolution and also on reticulate causation. We need to recognize communities as levels and as synergistic traits, and these synergistic traits are units that evolve at that level. And we also need to recognize reticulate causality and hierarchy theories. And so in that regard, I want to end by thanking the organizers, by thanking Anton for developing this idea of community level evolution with me. And I also want to reference you to the website and some of my other work. Thank you very much.